He never expected to see a swirl of neon paint dance in the night, like it was challenging the entire legacy of his family's wealth. He never expected to fall in love under a bridge, where the stench of spray paint and the burn of adrenaline made his heart pound harder than any boardroom confrontation. But he did, and now he could never go back to the way things were. From the moment James Alden stepped off his father's private jet at a secluded airstrip on the outskirts of the city, he felt a ripple of tension. The flight had been scheduled by his father's staff without his input, and the reason was painfully obvious. His father, the inimitable Sebastian Alden, billionaire tycoon and patriarch of the Alden family, had requested his presence. The word requested never felt like a mere invitation. It was always an order. James, who had spent years avoiding the family orbit, found himself dragged back into that sphere of power and expectation with a silent dread he couldn't quite shake. He was met by a driver at the airstrip, a man wearing a crisp black suit who nodded deferentially and asked no questions. James climbed into the waiting car with a breath of resignation, letting the tinted windows shut out the world he so craved to be part of. Over the last few years, he'd tried to escape this suffocating bubble of wealth. He'd lived in cramped apartments, traveled on a shoestring budget, and spent time in forgotten corners of the world. He didn't do it to punish himself. He did it to feel something real, something unmanicured by his father's influence. But no matter how far he went, the Alden name followed him like an inescapable shadow. The car weaved through the city's outskirts, a region James had once known only from tinted windows and official visits in bulletproof SUVs. He watched the rundown neighborhoods roll past, glimpsing colorful graffiti splashed across concrete walls. It was a world divorced from the lofty towers and penthouses he'd grown up in. This environment, raw and unfiltered, fascinated him more than he cared to admit. His heart thrummed at the sight of vibrant street murals covering the sides of abandoned buildings, capturing the grit and soul of a city he had never truly understood. What reason could Sebastian Alden possibly have to summon him here? James could hardly guess. Perhaps it was another attempt to coerce him into taking over a new subsidiary. Or maybe it was an elaborate scheme to lure him back into the family business. Whatever it was, James resolved to fulfill his father's demand quickly and then return to the life he had painstakingly built away from everything Alden. Yet fate had other plans. The car suddenly jerked to a stop in a congested street. The traffic was at a dead standstill. A large police presence was visible ahead, lights flashing red and blue against the facades of weathered buildings. The driver craned his neck, checking if there was a way around, but the crowd of people, curious onlookers, and boisterous activists made that impossible. James glanced at the driver, who spoke in a hushed tone. "Sir, I might need to find another route." James felt a pulse of impatience, but suppressed it. "Sure," he replied. "Do what you need to do." He didn't relish the idea of meeting with his father, so a delay was hardly unwelcome. Looking out the window, he noticed the vibrant splashes of color on a nearby wall. A mural of a phoenix rising from blazing flames caught his eye. Something about the strokes, the layers of color, and the message of rebirth resonated with him. The paint still looked fresh, like it was completed earlier that day. Intrigued, James rolled down the window to get a better look. The air smelled of city grit, car exhaust, and the faint tang of spray paint. He watched a figure, hooded and wiry, step back from the mural as though appraising it. Though half-shrouded by the gloom, James could see the slender angles of a woman's face when she lifted her hood a fraction. She brushed a stray curl behind her ear, and for a brief second, her gaze flickered toward the line of cars stuck in traffic. Their eyes met. James felt a sudden jolt, a shock of electricity. He had no idea who she was, but her defiant posture and the raw creativity in the mural called to him in a way no gala or gold-plated event ever had. She squinted, as if trying to see past the tinted window. He wondered if she recognized him, but then realized she couldn't have. His face wasn't often splashed across tabloids. He had managed to keep a relatively low profile compared to the rest of his family. There was a flash of momentary curiosity in her expression, and then she turned, raising a spray to add another detail to the mural. "You might want to close the window, sir," the driver murmured, noticing some rowdy individuals weaving between cars further up the road. A man and a woman were shouting about some local issue, banging on car hoods as they went. It seemed the driver was worried about confrontation. James closed the window automatically, but his gaze lingered on the muralist. Something about her drew him in, and he wished he could ask the driver to wait, just so he could observe her artistry for a moment longer. The driver sighed and glanced at him. This could take some time. We might be better off turning around. Let's do that, James said, more flatly than he intended. He forced himself to straighten in his seat and refocus. This was just a random street artist, and he had far bigger problems to worry about, like the unstoppable force that was his father. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of her intense eyes and the mesmerizing swirl of color she had coaxed onto a crumbling wall. It took another 20 minutes of backtracking and weaving through winding side streets before they finally arrived at the imposing Alden estate. Situated on the edge of the city, it was a sprawling testament to wealth. Tall iron gates, an immaculate driveway lined with imported trees, and a mansion that was more fortress than home. James felt the old knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had never been able to call this place home. It was a monument to his father's ambitions, a living mausoleum of countless expectations. The driver opened the door, and James stepped out, forced to crane his neck to take in the ornate facade. Before he could steel himself, an assistant in a sharply tailored suit appeared. "Mr. Alden, your father is waiting for you in the study." No greeting, no niceties. Just procedure. James nodded and followed the assistant through the enormous foyer with its marble floors and sparkling chandeliers. As he walked, he couldn't help but recall the chaotic paint-splashed street mural. Here, everything was silent, polished, and cold. It lacked any sense of soul. He felt like an intruder in this kingdom of hush and restraint. Finally, he was ushered into the study, a grand room lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read, and an array of priceless artifacts that served no other function than to impress. Sebastian Alden stood by the fireplace, a tall man with silvered hair and a posture that conveyed authority like a scepter. He turned at James's entrance, and for a split second, James saw something resembling relief in his father's eyes. But that emotion was quickly replaced by the usual stern mask. "You've arrived," Sebastian said. "Good. Traffic," James replied stiffly. "Got caught in some kind of protest." Sebastian waved a dismissive hand. The city's in constant turmoil these days. People with too much free time, complaining about anything and everything. James clenched his jaw but held his tongue. He'd given up trying to correct his father about such matters. Sebastian motioned for him to sit, and James reluctantly settled into one of the leather armchairs. He braced himself for the next demand or condemnation. "I'll get straight to the point," Sebastian said, leaning against the mantel. "I have a business opportunity that requires a delicate touch. It's a new urban development project, mixed-use properties, community revitalization, that sort of jargon. The city council requires us to involve local artists to dress up the buildings. Some nonsense about preserving urban culture." He paused, scanning James for a reaction. "I want you to coordinate it." James blinked. "Coordinate an art project?" Sebastian inclined his head. "Yes. They won't question you because you're my son, so access is guaranteed. But you also have that rebellious streak that may appeal to these so-called artists. You lived off the grid for a while, didn't you? Maybe that'll give us credibility." His lip curled slightly, an unsubtle judgment of James's escapades. James had half a mind to refuse outright. But he hesitated. He thought about the mural he'd seen earlier that day, the street artist who had locked eyes with him for an instant. He felt a tug of curiosity. What if he agreed to do this on his terms, using the opportunity to dive deeper into that world? "Fine," he finally said, controlling the bitterness in his tone. "I'll take on the project. But I'll do it my way." Sebastian narrowed his eyes, but nodded. "So long as it gets done. We're set to break ground in a month. You'll liaise with the city's artistic community, find talent, and handle everything. I expect results." James rose from the chair. "Are we done?" "For now," Sebastian said. "Your old room is prepared. Stay here. It'll be easier to coordinate everything." James fought the urge to say no, but he realized living elsewhere would only make the process more difficult. He forced a nod, then left the study with quick strides, ignoring the staff who lingered in the hallway. As he passed through the corridors, the memory of the woman painting that phoenix kept returning. Maybe it was a fleeting infatuation or just intrigue, but there was something about that moment that made him feel more alive than any conversation under this roof. He found himself standing at a balcony that overlooked the estate's manicured gardens. The setting sun threw long shadows across the lawn, but all he could think about was that vibrant mural in the dim alley, glowing with fresh paint. He exhaled slowly. This was going to be a strange collision of worlds. Sleep came fitfully that night. Memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. Arguments with his father, the day he decided to walk out on the Alden Empire, the humiliating feeling of being tracked by his father's men. Yet somewhere in the swirl of restless dreams, a bright phoenix soared, its colors defiant against the darkness. In the morning, James woke with a sense of determination. If he was going to do this, he would do it with honesty, no matter the conflict it caused with his father. He dressed simply, jeans and a fitted black sweater, before retrieving the keys to an older sedan he'd kept on the property. He refused to use the chauffeur or the flashy family cars. Driving into the heart of the city, James passed the area where traffic had halted him the day before. He parked near the same alley, adrenaline buzzing in his veins. The mural was still there, and in the daylight, it was even more magnificent. Bold colors depicting the phoenix's fiery wings stretched across cracked concrete. He let out a low whistle. Then he noticed she wasn't there. Disappointment flickered inside him. He didn't even know her name, yet he felt an urge to find her and tell her how impressive her work was. He strolled around the adjacent blocks, scanning each graffiti-laden wall for a clue. Eventually, he approached a local shopkeeper, an older woman who stood in the doorway of a bodega, sweeping the sidewalk. "Excuse me," he said, mustering a polite tone. "Do you know who painted that phoenix mural around the corner?" The woman eyed him suspiciously, her gaze flicking to his expensive shoes. Then she shrugged. "People come and go," she said, voice tinged with resignation. "I don't keep track of them." James sighed. He offered a brief thanks and wandered further down the street. He considered asking a few more passers-by, but something told him that might look suspicious. For all he knew, these artists preferred anonymity. Maybe she wouldn't want to be found. He turned a corner and noticed a smaller mural, a stylized signature in bold letters, Luna. The script was fluid, the color palette similar to the phoenix. Could that be her name? He stood there, studying the signature. That must be the tag she used. With a thrill of possibility, James realized this might not be the last time he'd see her. If she was a local street artist, maybe he could find more pieces with this same signature, follow the trail. He began to wander, ignoring the stares from curious locals. Soon he spotted a second tag and then a third. They led him into a less inviting neighborhood, the kind of place he would have been forbidden to enter during his sheltered upbringing. Yet he pressed on, determined. Eventually, he arrived at an abandoned warehouse with a sprawling mural depicting figures dancing under neon lights. In the corner, that same script, Luna. He spent the better part of the morning exploring these murals, each one more dazzling and emotive than the last. Some were purely aesthetic, while others conveyed political messages, calls to end inequality, tributes to lost souls. Her range was astonishing. The deeper he went, the more he found himself enthralled by her art. He considered how best to approach her. He had the resources to commission her for the urban development project, and that would be a straightforward transaction. But he suspected she might scoff at working with a billionaire's son. Then again, maybe he could convince her that he genuinely admired what she did. That he wanted to integrate real, authentic art into the project, not just corporate tokenism. Lost in thought, James glanced at his watch and realized he was running late for a meeting with the city's Arts Council. He rushed back to his car, mind already spinning with ways to mention Luna without sounding suspicious. The meeting was held in a modest municipal building. A round table of local officials, art advocates, and community representatives awaited him. They eyed him skeptically, clearly aware of his last name. He introduced himself simply as James and launched into a plan. He explained he wanted to identify artists with authentic ties to the neighborhood, people whose work could truly reflect the community's spirit. He emphasized that he wasn't looking for sanitized murals, but real expressions from real people. Some of the council members leaned forward, intrigued, while others remained wary. "You're Sebastian Alden's son," one of them said bluntly. "Why should we believe you have any genuine interest in grassroots art?" James took a breath. "I won't deny my connection to the Alden Empire, but I've seen the potential of street art firsthand. It's powerful. It can unite communities, inspire, and provoke thought. We want to incorporate that power into the new development. I'm here to ensure artists are treated fairly and compensated well for their talents. No strings attached." A stern-faced councilwoman, whose nameplate read Teresa Morales, regarded him closely. "We've dealt with developers before who promise community involvement and then serve us watered-down nonsense. If we agree to help you find these artists, how do we know you won't just slap corporate logos everywhere?" James shook his head. "That's not what I want. I want authenticity. No brand logos. No corporate slogans. The buildings will be a canvas for the community, not an advertisement. Teresa seemed to measure his words carefully. We'll hold you to that, she said at last. The rest of the meeting went smoothly enough, though James could sense the tension in the room. These people were rightfully protective of their art scene, suspicious of wealthy outsiders. He had to earn their trust one step at a time. As the session ended, James stayed behind to speak privately with Teresa. There's a particular artist I came across, he began. They signed their work with the name Luna. Do you know her? Teresa's expression flickered with recognition. Yes, I know who you mean, but she's elusive. Doesn't often collaborate with city initiatives. She prefers to remain underground. James paused. I saw her work. It's incredible. I'd like to connect with her, but I'm not sure how. Teresa let out a short laugh. Good luck. She's known for vanishing after she finishes a piece. But she does occasionally show up at certain local art gatherings. There's one tomorrow night at a community center on the east side. It's an open house for street artists to share their work. You might catch her there, if she decides to appear. Thanking Teresa, James left the building feeling a spark of optimism. There was a chance he might see Luna again and speak to her. The thought made him strangely nervous, a sensation he wasn't used to. In his old life of high society events, he'd never felt butterflies. Everything had been choreographed and predictable. But stepping into Luna's world was like diving headfirst into uncertainty. Returning to the Alden estate, James endured another silent dinner with his father. Sebastian barely asked about the council meeting, too preoccupied with the day's market fluctuations. James didn't volunteer any information either. He knew how it would end. His father would mock the artist's demands or the idea of community-driven design as naive. So James said little, finishing his meal quickly and retreating to his room. That night, he lay awake thinking of the woman behind those murals. He imagined how she would react to a developer's offer. Perhaps she'd paint an insult on his tailored shirt, and vanish into the night. Yet a part of him hoped she'd see that he was different. He drifted to sleep, his thoughts filled with neon colors and the faint hiss of a spray can. The next evening, James drove to the community center on the east side. It was a modest building, its walls covered with bright, chaotic graffiti that gave it a rebellious flair. Inside, tables displayed paintings, sketches, and prints. A small stage at the back featured a microphone, presumably for spoken-word performances. The room was teeming with artists, students, and enthusiasts, a diverse crowd that hummed with excitement. James felt out of place, yet strangely at home. He admired the raw talent on display, the unabashed self-expression. Wandering from table to table, he chatted with a few artists, praising their work. Some recognized his last name when he introduced himself, but he was careful to emphasize he wanted authentic collaborations, not forced corporate synergy. He scanned the crowd for any sign of Luna, but the mix of people in hoodies, beanies, and paint-splattered clothing made it hard to differentiate one from another. Just as he began to think she wouldn't show, he spotted a new figure near a partially covered mural along the far wall. Her stance was intense, her posture guarded, and she clutched a spray can in one hand. Though her hood was drawn, James caught a glimpse of her face beneath the indoor lights. It was her. His heart hammered. He started toward her, weaving between bodies. She was in a hushed conversation with someone. Drawing closer, he heard snippets of their exchange. Not sure if I can paint at your event, she was saying. It depends on how legit it is. James took another step, and she noticed him. Their eyes met, and for an instant, everything else dulled. She raised an eyebrow, as if recognizing him from the day before. The man she was talking to glanced curiously at James, then excused himself, leaving them face to face. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. She looked at him expectantly, so he finally extended a hand. Hi, I'm James. She studied him, ignoring his offered hand. You're the guy from the car yesterday. The tinted window. He dropped his hand with a small smile. Guilty. Your art. I saw your Phoenix mural. It blew me away. Her guard remained firmly in place. It's just paint on a wall. Not that big of a deal. He shook his head. It's a huge deal. The colors, the energy, the symbolism. I've never seen anything like it. You're talented, Luna. She tilted her head, a spark of curiosity in her eyes. You know my name. I noticed your signature on other murals. I asked around. She folded her arms. Why were you asking? What do you want? James could practically feel the suspicion radiating off her, and he understood. Countless posers had probably tried to exploit her talents. He kept his voice earnest. "I'm working on an urban development project." She scoffed, cutting him off. "Ah, so you're a developer. That explains the fancy car." "Wait," he said quickly. "Let me explain. I'm not your typical developer. Yes, I'm connected to the Alden family, but I want the art to be genuine. I don't want to censor it or use it for cheap branding. I want to pay local artists what they're worth to bring real street art into these spaces." Her expression was guarded, but her eyes flickered with interest. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I believe in what you do," he said simply. "I believe in the power of that kind of expression. I'm trying to do something different." She studied him for a long moment. "People say a lot of pretty words, but they rarely follow through." He nodded, acknowledging her skepticism. "All I can do is invite you to a meeting or show you the space. If you decide it's a sellout job, you can walk away. No strings. No corporate BS." She stared at him, her silence weighing on the moment. Finally, she shrugged. "Maybe I'll check it out. No promises." A cautious grin spread across James's face. "That's more than I expected." He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "My personal number's on there. Give me a call whenever you want to see the site." She took the card, eyeing the crisp lettering. "James Alden," she read aloud, her lips twisting slightly. "Big name. Let's see if you can live up to it." Before he could respond, someone called her name from across the room. Luna glanced over her shoulder, then stuffed the card into her back pocket. "I gotta go," she said. "But thanks for saying my art matters." "It does," James said, meeting her gaze. "More than you know." She gave a half nod, then strode away, melting into the crowd. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He felt a surge of exhilaration. She was tough, skeptical, and definitely not someone who'd be easily impressed by wealth. But there was a spark, a glimmer of possibility that intrigued him beyond reason. He lingered in the community center for another hour, talking to artists and exchanging contact information with a few who seemed interested. But his mind kept drifting to Luna. He couldn't ignore the way his heart had raced when she looked at him. He recalled her confident stance, the defiance in her eyes, a stark contrast to the polished, reserved people in his father's circle. Driving back to the Alden estate, James felt caught between two worlds. The lavish mansion loomed before him, yet all he could think about was that battered community center, alive with creativity. He found himself wishing he didn't have to return here, that he could throw himself entirely into that gritty scene. But he knew better. His father's summons forced him to exist in both realms, at least for now. That night, as he lay in bed, he replayed his conversation with Luna over and over. He expected to feel foolish, infatuated with a woman he barely knew, but instead he felt something deeper. Perhaps it was the same sense of wonder he'd experienced when he first walked away from his predetermined destiny. She embodied that rebellious spark he yearned for. She was an artist who bared her soul on crumbling walls, who answered to no one. And he was the estranged heir to a billion-dollar empire, tethered to a life he despised. How could their paths truly intersect without one engulfing the other? He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew he wanted to find out. Sleep overtook him eventually, and in his dreams, paint dripped from the sky, coloring everything in vivid shades of rebellion and hope. When morning came, a light knock on his door roused him. He found a note slipped underneath, presumably from one of the staff. It read, "Your father requests your presence at breakfast." James smirked, half tempted to ignore it. But he decided to face Sebastian, if only to maintain some level of cooperation while he prepared his own plans. He dressed quickly and made his way to the dining room, where Sebastian was already seated at the head of the table, scanning a financial newspaper. He barely looked up as James entered. "The new project is all over the news," Sebastian remarked, tapping the paper. "They're praising our community approach." James forced a tight smile. "That's good." Sebastian's gaze flicked up. "Don't get used to it. Good press can evaporate the moment you make a single misstep. I expect you to remain on top of this." James bristled at the tone. "I am on top of it. I met with the Arts Council. We're identifying street artists." Sebastian set the newspaper aside. "Street art is one thing, but don't let them run wild. We need appealing visuals, not anarchist slogans that scare off investors." James clenched his jaw, choosing his words carefully. "You said I have full control over the artistic aspect. Let me handle it." A tense silence hung between them. Finally, Sebastian nodded curtly. Just remember to keep the company's image in mind. James gave a non-committal grunt, finishing his coffee quickly. He left the table, ignoring the elaborate spread of pastries. He had no appetite. All he could think about was the fragile alliance he was forming with the city's art scene, and, more specifically, with Luna. Days stretched into a week. James busied himself setting up preliminary agreements with a handful of local artists. He visited potential sites, ensuring that the spaces truly lent themselves to meaningful art, not just decorative backgrounds. He fought with the developers over budget allocations, insisting on fair compensation for artists. It was a constant battle, but he refused to yield. He heard nothing from Luna, and an undercurrent of disappointment gnawed at him. Maybe she decided it wasn't worth her time. Maybe she saw him as just another privileged poser trying to buy street credibility. But then, late one afternoon, his phone buzzed. He snatched it up, heart pounding. The caller ID was blocked. With a jolt of anticipation, he answered, "Hello?" There was a pause. Then a quiet voice. "It's Luna." Relief flooded him. He turned away from the staff bustling in the hallway, stepping into an empty side room for privacy. "Hey, it's good to hear from you. You said you'd show me the space," she said, voice cautious. "I'm free tonight." James's throat tightened with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Of course. I can pick you up, or I'll meet you there. Text me the address." He almost laughed at himself for being so eager. "All right. 8 o'clock. Sure. I'll see you then." She hung up abruptly, leaving James staring at his phone with a grin he couldn't hide. Tonight, he'd have a chance to show her that this was more than a glossy corporate ploy. He only hoped she believed him. By 7:30, he was pacing around the project site, a sprawling building that was still under renovation. The city skyline glimmered in the distance, and the site itself was bathed in the harsh glow of construction lights. He'd arranged for a security guard to allow them after-hours access. It was quiet except for the occasional clang of metal or hum of machinery. He heard footsteps and turned. Luna emerged from the shadows, wearing a simple black jacket and carrying a small bag over her shoulder. Her eyes flicked around, taking in the half-finished structure, the skeletal scaffolding, and the fresh concrete. She looked skeptical, but also intrigued. "This is it?" she asked. He nodded. "Phase 1. There'll be more buildings around it eventually, but this is the main hub for commercial and residential space." She walked deeper into the construction zone, stepping carefully over scattered tools. "It's massive. What part do you want me to paint?" James followed her, heart pounding. "Honestly, wherever you see potential. Some of the walls in the inner courtyard, the exteriors of the upper floors, even certain interior corridors. I want you to have freedom." She tilted her head, considering. "And your father is okay with that?" James exhaled. "He's not thrilled about me giving artists carte blanche, but he's left the details to me for now." She paused, turning to face him, her eyes narrowing. "And do you really want something raw and real, or is that just your sales pitch?" "I meant every word," he said, meeting her gaze. "I won't lie to you. There are investors watching. But I truly believe this project can showcase the city's authentic art scene. I won't demand that you sanitize your work." She studied him, her silence weighing on the moment. At last, she nodded slowly. "All right. I'll think about it. I'll come up with a concept." James felt a rush of elation. "Thank you." He gestured toward a makeshift break area where construction workers usually ate their lunches. A few folding chairs and a table stood under a spotlight. "We can sit for a minute if you want." She shrugged, following him over. They settled in the chairs, an awkward silence enveloping them. He noticed the flecks of paint on her hands, the subtle streaks of color near her nails. Every detail about her seemed alive with creation. "I'm curious," he said, careful not to sound too probing. "What got you into street art in the first place?" She shrugged as if the question was trivial. "I grew up in a rough part of town. Not much else to do. I saw graffiti on the walls and wanted to leave my own mark. It felt good to make something beautiful out of nothing." He nodded, absorbing her words. "And you're incredible at it. Do you do gallery shows or anything like that?" She shook her head. "Galleries are too polished. They don't feel real to me. Street art is about the rawness, the spontaneity. You put it out there for everyone, not just the fancy people who can afford to pay for a ticket." James smiled wryly. "Trust me, I understand not wanting to live in that fancy bubble." He hesitated, wondering if he should open up about himself. He decided to take the risk. "I used to be groomed for that world, galas, black tie events, all of it. It never felt like my own. So I left. Her eyes flicked to his. Why? He sighed. Because I wanted something real. An existence not controlled by my father's every whim. I traveled. I worked odd jobs. I tried to figure out who I was without the Alden name. I'm still not sure I know. She studied him thoughtfully, and for the first time, her guarded demeanor softened. Well, that's more honest than I expected. James felt a warmth spread through him at her subtle approval. He wanted to ask more about her life, but sensed she wasn't one to reveal much easily. Instead, he said, if you decide to do this project, I promise you won't regret it. I can't guarantee my father won't meddle, but I'll do everything I can to protect your creative freedom. She inclined her head, exhaling a quiet laugh. You talk a big game. Let's see if you can deliver. She stood, brushing off her jacket. I should go. It's getting late. James quickly rose. Let me walk you out. They made their way back through the construction zone in silence. The security guard nodded as they passed. When they reached the chain-link gate, Luna paused, turning to face him. I'll call you, she said. If I have questions or when I'm ready to start. He nodded. I'll be waiting. She gave a faint smile and then disappeared into the darkness beyond the lights, leaving James alone with the hollow skeleton of the future building. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. In that fleeting smile, he saw a glimmer of acceptance, maybe even trust. Yet he knew how fragile it was. Over the next several days, Luna visited the site sporadically. She'd come unannounced, walking the grounds, scribbling notes, snapping photos with an old phone. Sometimes James would be there. Other times he'd only hear about her visits from the construction workers. He tried not to press too hard, giving her space to find her inspiration on her own terms. Meanwhile, he continued meeting with other artists, finalizing contracts for those who'd agreed to participate. Each time, he made sure their creative freedom was intact. It earned him a few raised eyebrows from the corporate side, but he stood his ground. Late one night, James's phone vibrated. The caller ID was blocked again. He answered immediately, heart jumping. Hello, it's Luna. I think I'm ready. He sat up in bed. Ready. I have a concept for the main wall in the courtyard. I'll need scaffolding and a few days of uninterrupted work. James swung his legs over the edge of the bed, excitement flooding him. That's amazing. Whatever you need, I'll make it happen. She paused. Don't thank me yet. It won't be some safe, pretty mural that pleases your father. But it'll be something real. You sure you're prepared for that? A grin tugged at his lips. More than you know. She exhaled softly. All right. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon at the site. Make sure the space is clear. He agreed, and she hung up. James pressed his phone to his chest, a swirl of conflicting emotions within him. Excitement for the art she'd create, anxiety about his father's inevitable reaction, and something else, a growing affection for the fierce woman who refused to compromise her vision. At noon the next day, James arranged for a portion of the courtyard to be cordoned off. A portable scaffold was set up, and paint supplies were delivered. He paced around, waiting, checking his phone for any sign of her. Just when he began to worry she might not come, Luna appeared, dragging a battered suitcase full of spray cans and brushes. She surveyed the setup, nodding at the scaffolding. This'll do. As the construction workers cleared the area, James helped her unpack the paints. He noticed how meticulously she'd labeled each can, how carefully she prepared her brushes. She was methodical in her chaos, an artist who took her work seriously. Once everything was ready, she shooed him away. I need space to create. No hovering. He chuckled. All right, I can take a hint. I'll be around if you need anything. She climbed onto the scaffold, a half-smile crossing her face. Thank you for all this. Her voice was quieter, more sincere than he'd ever heard it. Don't mention it, he said, stepping back. I'm just glad to have you here. She stared at him for a moment, then turned to face the blank wall, raising a can of paint. With that, she began. Hours melted into dusk. James hovered in the background, occasionally bringing water or sandwiches, though she barely paused. The courtyard was filled with the hypnotic sound of spray cans, the rustle of plastic tarps, and Luna's measured breathing. He watched as the wall erupted in color. Swirling shapes, bold lines, a tapestry that blended the harsh reality of the city with a spark of defiance and hope. By the time she climbed down for the evening, the mural was partially formed, and James felt humbled by its raw power. It depicted a towering figure, arms raised as though holding up the weight of the sky, while faceless silhouettes reached upwards in solidarity. It's incredible, he breathed. I've never seen anything like it. She shrugged off the praise, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. It's just the beginning. They sat on a low wall, eating sandwiches and talking in hushed tones. He asked her about her life, carefully testing the boundaries of her trust. She revealed fragments: an absent father, a mother who worked multiple jobs, a childhood spent on the streets. She didn't delve into details, and he didn't push. She asked him about his travels, and he recounted tales of sleeping in rundown hostels, befriending strangers who never knew he was an Alden. They both carried wounds, albeit in different shapes. As the stars emerged overhead, Luna stood and stretched. I need to get some sleep before tomorrow. James nodded, escorting her to the gate once more. She paused there, looking back at the building and then at him. I'll be back early. Thanks for making sure no suits came by to breathe down my neck. He laughed softly. They won't disturb you. I promise. She gave him that faint smile again, and for a moment he felt something shift between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of a deeper connection. Then she turned and vanished into the night. Over the following days, the mural blossomed into something truly awe-inspiring. It drew the attention of construction workers, local passers-by, and even a few reporters who'd gotten wind of the project. Luna worked with tireless dedication, ignoring the curious onlookers. James managed to keep corporate overseers at bay, though he sensed their curiosity was piqued. One afternoon, near the mural's completion, James brought Luna some lunch. She hopped off the scaffold, wiping sweat and paint from her forehead. I'm almost done, she said, a strange mix of pride and sorrow in her voice. Feels weird. This is one of the biggest pieces I've ever done. James handed her a sandwich. It's beautiful, he said, looking up at the powerful images that seemed to leap off the wall. A fitting tribute to the city. She glanced at him. You see it as a tribute? He nodded. The struggle, the resilience, the collective reaching for something greater. That's this city. A faint smile tugged at her lips. Yeah, I guess it is. They stood there in companionable silence, eating. A gentle breeze carried the lingering scent of paint. James felt an urge to reach out, to touch her hand, to bridge the space between them. But he didn't. Instead, he ventured softly. Would you like to join me for dinner tonight? Away from here, away from. He gestured at the construction site. She raised an eyebrow. Dinner? Like a date? Her directness made him chuckle, though his nerves spiked. Yeah, a date. She studied him carefully. I'm not really the type to do fancy dinners. He shook his head quickly. We can go wherever you want. A food truck. A little family restaurant. Something real. She hesitated, then nodded. Okay, let me finish this piece, and I'll meet you at your car. That evening, with the mural complete, they drove to a modest taco joint James had discovered during his time away from the Alden world. It was crowded and noisy, filled with families and couples. They managed to snag a small corner table, ordering tacos and cold drinks. Luna seemed at ease in this environment, and James was relieved to see her shoulders relax, her guard slightly lowered. They talked about everything and nothing: music, travel, urban legends, the weirdest places they'd ever slept. Luna laughed when James recounted an incident involving a tiny hostel in Peru and a llama that wandered into the courtyard. He savored the sound of her laughter, realizing how rarely he'd heard it. Eventually, the conversation turned more personal. She asked about his estrangement from his father, and he admitted how stifling the Alden dynasty could be. It's like living under a microscope, he said. Every move is scrutinized. Every mistake is amplified. She sipped her drink, eyes thoughtful. Must be nice, though, to never worry about money. He tensed, unsure how to respond. I won't deny it's a privilege. But money also comes with strings, expectations, and greed. It can destroy relationships. She nodded. I've seen that. They fell into a pensive silence, each contemplating the costs of their respective worlds. Then Luna's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Her expression soured. Sorry, I need to step outside for a second, she said, standing abruptly. James watched her go, feeling a flicker of concern. She seemed tense as she answered the call, pacing near the restaurant's entrance. He wondered if it was about her mother or someone else from her past. Moments later, she returned, her mood visibly darker. Everything okay? He asked softly. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yeah, just life stuff. He wanted to press for details, but sensed she wouldn't share, so he let it go. They finished their meal in quieter spirits. He walked her to the car, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. At the passenger door, she paused, turning to him. "I had a nice time," she said quietly. "Thanks." She leaned in, and for a moment, James felt her breath on his cheek. The impulse to kiss her rushed through him, but she stepped back, catching herself, as if uncertain. He respected her hesitation, giving a small nod instead. "Same here," he said, voice thick. The drive back was filled with subdued conversation. She asked to be dropped off near the community center. As she stepped out of the car, she seemed hesitant, almost like she wanted to say something. Then she merely said, "See you around," and closed the door. James watched her retreating figure, wrestling with the complicated mix of emotions swirling in his chest: admiration, longing, worry. He felt compelled to protect her from whatever burden she carried, yet he hardly knew the details. In that moment, he recognized that their worlds really were colliding, forging a connection neither of them fully understood. He returned to the Alden estate, the imposing gates feeling like a barrier between him and a reality that felt far more genuine. Tomorrow, corporate overseers would come to inspect the murals and ensure they aligned with brand values. He had no idea how that would go, and a part of him dreaded telling Luna that some of these suits would be poking around her artwork. But he was determined to shield her from their meddling as best as he could. Later that night, as he stood on the balcony of his lavish bedroom, looking out at the city lights, he felt the weight of the collision between the two worlds. He was bridging a gap, wealth and privilege on one side, raw artistic freedom on the other. And in the middle of it all stood Luna, a living embodiment of the city's heartbeat. He knew there would be consequences. But he also knew that meeting her was changing him in ways he never expected. When morning came, he braced himself for the corporate visit. He texted Luna to give her a heads up. No reply. The investors arrived in sleek cars, led by a representative from Alden Enterprises who carried an air of smug confidence. He gave them a brief tour, pointing out completed art installations from other local creators, which garnered polite smiles. Finally, they reached Luna's mural. James watched their faces carefully as they took in the vibrant, often haunting imagery. A few nodded in appreciation, but the representative frowned slightly. "It's very strong," he said. "Could be controversial." James arched an eyebrow. "That's the point. Street art isn't always comfortable. It's meant to provoke thought." The representative offered a perfunctory nod. "We'll take it under advisement." A flicker of anger rose in James's chest. Take it under advisement? The mural was finished, and he refused to let them censor it. Still, he forced a neutral expression. "I believe it will resonate with the community." "Isn't that what we said we wanted?" The representative glanced at the others. "Yes, of course. We'll see how it's received." With that, they moved on, discussing more mundane aspects of the project. James lingered for a moment, gaze fixed on the mural, silent gratitude for the passion Luna had poured into it. When they finished, the representative clapped James on the shoulder. "Good work bridging the gap with these local artists. Your father will be pleased. Just remember, we need to maintain the Alden reputation." James mustered a thin smile. "The Alden reputation will benefit more from authenticity than from trying to whitewash what's real." The man looked unconvinced, but nodded diplomatically. As they departed, James's phone buzzed. A text from Luna. "All good?" He typed back. They saw it. "Some are unsure, but no changes. You did great." He hesitated, then added, "I'd love to talk again soon." After hitting send, he slid his phone into his pocket, wondering if he was in over his head. The line between business and something far more personal was blurring. He didn't care. He was prepared to fight for her work, for her respect, and maybe even for her heart. That afternoon, he received a summons from his father. Sebastian was seated in his study, the usual air of authority thick around him. "I understand you gave a certain artist carte blanche," he said without preamble. James squared his shoulders. "Yes, and her work is phenomenal. It aligns with the project's community-centered vision." Sebastian's eyes narrowed. Some of the investors find it too edgy. They're worried about negative backlash, associations with radical movements. James shook his head. "Then they don't understand street art. This is what the community wants, and it's what will give our development a unique identity." Sebastian studied him for a moment. "You're awfully passionate about this artist. Is there more going on here than just business?" James's chest tightened. He met his father's gaze with guarded defiance. "I admire her work. That's all you need to know." Sebastian's expression betrayed a flicker of frustration. "Fine. But remember, every decision you make reflects on this family. Don't let your personal interests jeopardize what we've built. James clenched his fists at his sides. I'm trying to do what's right for once. If that jeopardizes your empire, maybe it's worth reconsidering what we've actually built. Sebastian's face hardened. Be careful, James. You may be my son, but you're not indispensable. With that, James turned on his heel and left the study, anger coursing through him. He realized just how precarious his position was. If Sebastian wanted, he could sabotage the entire project, pull the funding, and shut it down. The only reason he hadn't done so yet was likely because of the positive press they were receiving for championing local artists. As he walked out of the mansion, James felt the suffocating weight of his father's empire. He needed to escape, if only for a moment. He grabbed his car keys and drove aimlessly through the city. Without conscious thought, he found himself at the building that housed Luna's mural. The courtyard was empty and silent. He stood there, gazing at the bold shapes and vivid colors, feeling the raw energy of her expression. Suddenly, a presence behind him made him turn. Luna stepped out from behind some stacked crates, carrying a small spray can. "What are you doing here?" she asked, sounding more curious than accusatory. James let out a long breath. "Escaping." She set down the can and approached. "Rough day at the office, Mr. Billionaire?" He tried to smile, but it came out strained. "You could say that. My father thinks I'm making the project too controversial." Luna looked at the mural, her voice quiet. "I know they can paint over it any time they want." He frowned. "I won't let that happen." She studied him, reading the conflict in his eyes. "You might not have a choice if your father is who I think he is." James looked away, frustration tightening his chest. "I'll fight him if I have to. I've never felt like I belonged in that world. But this," he motioned to her art, "this feels real, like something worth defending." They stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing on them. Then, tentatively, she reached out and brushed her fingers against his forearm. The simple contact sent a thrill through him. He turned, meeting her gaze. Time seemed to pause, and he leaned in, capturing her lips in a gentle, hesitant kiss. She froze for an instant, then responded, her hand moving to the back of his neck. It was a fragile, charged moment, a collision of wealth and raw artistry, of two souls who had wandered too far from their respective paths. When they finally broke apart, Luna's eyes were glistening with a dozen unspoken emotions. James felt dizzy with longing, fear, hope. She stepped back, crossing her arms protectively over her chest, as if shocked by her own vulnerability. Without a word, she turned away, hurrying toward the exit of the courtyard. James called after her softly, but she didn't stop. She vanished into the darkening street, leaving him alone in the shadows of the towering walls. He stared at the mural, at the towering figure holding up the sky, and felt the crushing weight of their divided worlds. Even so, he couldn't shake a quiet certainty. Something momentous had begun between them. He could only hope it wouldn't be destroyed by the forces that sought to keep them apart. James spent the next day alternating between pacing his room and scrolling anxiously through his phone, hoping for some word from Luna. Each time his screen lit up with a notification, a spike of anticipation flickered through him. But it was never her. Only emails from the architectural teams, messages from artists confirming their interest in the project, or various forwarded communications from his father's staff. By evening, the urge to seek her out became overwhelming, yet he resisted. The memory of her abrupt departure after their kiss still rattled him. He worried that pressing too hard might drive her away. At dusk, he decided to leave the estate for a more personal errand. He drove to a small florist shop tucked between two rundown buildings on the fringe of downtown. An elderly florist greeted him with surprise. He clearly didn't get many well-dressed customers at that hour. James, feeling slightly out of place, asked for a simple bouquet. No lavish arrangement, nothing that screamed wealth, just a modest cluster of wildflowers. He wasn't even sure he would give them to Luna. Still, having them felt like a promise, a physical manifestation of the tenuous hope he carried. He returned to the building's site, where security lights cast sharp shadows against the walls. The mural glowed under the harsh fluorescent glow, a testament to Luna's passion. James approached it, half expecting to see her there, perhaps adding a secret flourish or checking on her work. But the courtyard was empty. The flowers, resting in the passenger seat of his car, felt like a foolish gesture now. He stood before the mural, shoulders slumped. The powerful imagery stirred something within him, a collision of hope and anguish. He recalled how Luna had said this was one of the biggest pieces she'd ever done, how it felt strange for her to leave such a bold imprint in a space owned by a corporate giant. He wondered if it weighed on her conscience that, despite James's assurances, her art was still tied to the Alden empire. His phone buzzed. The screen showed a text from her. "Are you at the site?" His heart leapt. "Yes," he typed back immediately. Courtyard. A minute later, footsteps echoed beyond the chain-link fence. Luna emerged into the courtyard light, her hood pulled low. She glanced around warily, as though she expected corporate spies to leap from behind scaffolding. When she spotted James, her posture softened. "You came back," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of a distant generator. "I wanted to see the mural again," James replied. "And to see you." Her lips pressed into a thin line, neither smiling nor frowning. After a pause, she walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "I'm sorry about running off yesterday." He shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology. I get it, it was a lot all at once." She exhaled. "I'm not used to that kind of connection. Or confusion." Her gaze flicked upward, meeting his. "My life isn't exactly stable, and I'm not sure what to do with any of this." James found a small spark of relief that she was talking about it at all. "I'm not looking for a commitment you can't give," he said. "But I do want you to know I care about you. And I want to make sure you're okay." Her eyes glistened with a guarded emotion. "You don't have to worry about me. I've been on my own for a long time." "Doesn't mean I want you to stay that way," he murmured. She looked down, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I got a call last night. My mom's not well. I help cover her expenses, but it's never enough. Hospitals, medication, rent, it piles up. The real world has a way of pulling me back, no matter how hard I try to stay free." James listened intently, wishing he had a better response than an offer of money. He understood how quickly that gesture could taint things between them. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "Is there anything?" She held up a hand. "Don't. I'm not looking for your charity." Then her expression wavered, guilt crossing her face. "I don't mean to snap. It's just, I know how it looks if I start taking money from a billionaire's kid, especially after painting these walls for his family's project. It wouldn't feel right." He nodded. "I won't insult you by offering. But know that if you ever need help, real help, I'll give it. No strings." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks. I appreciate that." A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Luna cleared her throat. "Can we go somewhere else? I keep thinking people are watching us here." James gestured to his car. "Anywhere you want." She cast a last look at the mural, then followed him out of the courtyard. As they exited, the security guard gave them a polite nod, and James made a mental note to reinforce that no one was to bother Luna if she returned to paint or just to visit. Soon they were driving through quiet streets, passing shuttered shops and flickering streetlights. A low-hanging moon bathed the pavement in a ghostly sheen. "There's a spot by the river," Luna suggested. "Not the touristy one. A bit further down." James followed her directions until they reached a deserted stretch of riverbank. Tall reeds sprouted along the water's edge, and the silhouette of an old dock jutted out like a dark skeleton against the rippling surface. He parked, and they stepped onto the damp ground. The city's skyline sparkled in the distance, a reminder of the world they were momentarily leaving behind. They walked side by side, the night air cool against their faces. Luna stopped at a spot where the bank dipped slightly, creating a small, hidden cove. She sat on a large rock, hugging her knees to her chest. James settled beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. The hush of running water filled the space where words struggled to form. "This is my thinking spot," Luna said at last. "When things get too loud in my head, I come here." James glanced at the water, where moonlight revealed scattered debris. It wasn't a picturesque park, but it held a raw, unpolished beauty. "I can see why you like it." She drew in a breath, letting it out slowly. "You want to know the truth?" She didn't wait for him to answer. "I was half ready to vanish after finishing the mural. I've done that before. Paint, collect my fee, disappear before anyone can box me in." James swallowed. "What stopped you?" She met his gaze. "You did. I've never been this drawn to someone from a life so different from mine. It scares me, but I can't pretend it doesn't exist." A wave of emotion swept through him. He reached out, touching her hand lightly. This time she allowed it. "It scares me too," he admitted, "but it also feels right." They sat there for a long while, hands entwined, letting the quiet and the soft rhythm of the river speak for them. James wondered how such a moment of peace could exist when both of them were entangled in obligations and looming threats. Sebastian's empire, Luna's financial struggles, the expectations of an entire city. Eventually, Luna unfolded her legs and stood. "It's late. I should go. I have to check on my mom tomorrow. Can I drive you?" James offered. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's a bit out of the way, but sure." In the car, she gave him directions to a modest apartment block in a neighborhood that had once promised revitalization, only to be swept aside for more lucrative developments. The buildings were worn, paint peeling from balconies. James parked near a flickering street lamp, tension pricking at him. Two men loitered near an entrance, eyeing his car with predatory curiosity. Luna unfastened her seatbelt. "Thanks for tonight," she said softly. "And for understanding." He looked at her, a knot of concern in his chest. "Be safe. Text me if you need anything." She gave a small nod. "I will." She reached for the door handle, then paused, leaning back toward him. Her lips brushed his cheek in a featherlight gesture of gratitude before she slipped out and disappeared into the shadows of the building's corridor. James exhaled, resting his forehead against the steering wheel for a moment. The swirl of emotions, relief, longing, worry, threatened to drown him. Then he started the car and drove back to the Alden estate, alone with his thoughts. He found himself pausing at a red light not far from his childhood home, recalling the bouquet of wildflowers he'd left in the passenger seat earlier. They were still there, quietly wilting. He glanced at them with a rueful smile. So much for that plan. By the time he reached the estate, it was nearly midnight. The mansion loomed, dark windows like watchful eyes. James slipped in through a side entrance to avoid the night staff, but as he reached the grand staircase, the dining room light flicked on. He froze, turning to see Sebastian standing there, arms folded over his chest. "Late night," his father observed. "Busy with the project?" James's pulse quickened. "Something like that." Sebastian gestured for him to step into the dining room. Reluctantly, James followed, feeling the hush of the massive space swallow him. The older man took a seat at the head of the table, not offering James one. A silent power move. "Investors are still uneasy," Sebastian began, drumming his fingers on the table's surface. "They're talking about potential protests, negative press. Street art is good for PR so long as it's friendly, not incendiary." James clenched his jaw. "You saw the mural. It's powerful, but it's not encouraging riots or anything extreme. It's a representation of community struggle. If anything, it humanizes our project." Sebastian's gaze was unwavering. "Perhaps. But some lines in the piece, those faceless figures, the slogans hidden in the background, might be interpreted as anti-corporate. Investors are edgy." "Then let them be edgy," James snapped, surprising himself with his boldness. "We said we wanted authenticity. This is it." A cold silence stretched before Sebastian spoke again. "You're risking the entire operation. Urban development is a delicate balance of profit, perception, and politics. If your little romance with this street artist threatens any of that, I will step in." James's heart hammered. "It's not a romance. This is about fostering real art, not hollow branding." A thin, knowing smile curved Sebastian's lips. "I'm your father, James. You think I don't notice how you've been these past few weeks? You're infatuated with her. You're letting your personal feelings dictate business decisions." James swallowed hard. "I'm still fulfilling my role. The project is moving forward." Sebastian stood, the scrape of his chair echoing across the polished floor. "For your sake, I hope this works out. If it doesn't, I won't hesitate to remove her art, or you, from the equation." He turned on his heel, striding out before James could respond. James remained there, fists balled at his sides, struggling to rein in his fury. Finally, he spun and headed to his room, determined to keep the promise he'd made to Luna. He would protect her work, no matter what. The next few days blurred. James immersed himself in meetings, half of which involved placating restless investors or city council members with carefully chosen words about community engagement. Outside of official business, he juggled discreet phone calls to check on Luna. She visited her mother daily, though she never spoke in detail about the older woman's condition. Their conversations were brief, but held an unspoken closeness. With every word, James felt the bond between them deepen. One afternoon, James's phone rang with an unknown number. He answered, expecting an artist inquiry. A cold, curt voice replied, "Mr. Alden? My name is Alan Ward. I'm with the city's permitting department." James straightened. Yes. What can I do for you? There's been a complaint regarding the mural at the new development site. Something about inflammatory imagery. We'll be conducting an inspection tomorrow. James's stomach sank. Complaint from whom? That information is confidential, Ward said. I just wanted to inform you that we'll be assessing whether the art violates city ordinances. If it's deemed in violation, it will have to be removed. James barely kept his frustration in check. Understood. I'll be there. He hung up, seething. Someone was trying to sabotage Luna's work, and he had a sickening suspicion his father's hand wasn't far from this development. Censorship, couched in official language, was Sebastian's style. He never got his own hands dirty when he could manipulate bureaucratic levers instead. That evening, James called Luna. She answered with a subdued hello. There's a problem, he said, launching into an explanation of the impending inspection. She was silent for several beats. Then, in a trembling voice, she asked, They can force me to remove it? They'll try, James muttered. But I'm going to fight it. Another pause. Then, with an edge of desperation, what if I just took it down myself? Painted over it before they can have the satisfaction. He felt a surge of alarm. No, don't do that. This is your art, Luna. It means something to people. It was never supposed to be some political stunt. Her voice wavered. It was personal. Now it's turning into a battleground. It doesn't have to, James said. I'll handle it. Please trust me. A tearful breath crackled through the line. I'm tired, James. My mom's getting worse, the bills are piling up, and now this. It's like I can't escape. He ached to comfort her, to fix everything, but the line between supporting her and overstepping felt razor thin. You don't have to face this alone, he murmured. We'll figure it out. She said nothing, but the silence had a heaviness to it, as if she was weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she whispered, Okay, and hung up. The following morning, James arrived early at the site. He'd called in a favor from Teresa Morales of the Arts Council, briefing her on the sudden inspection. Teresa, outraged, agreed to show up as well. A handful of local reporters had been discreetly tipped off, too. James knew that public scrutiny would make it harder for city officials to undertake an arbitrary removal of the art. When Alan Ward showed up, tall, stern-faced, wearing a navy suit, he was visibly taken aback by the small gathering waiting for him. Mr. Alden, he greeted stiffly. We're here to evaluate potential violations. James nodded, stepping aside to let Ward and his colleagues examine the mural. Teresa stood by, arms folded, glaring daggers. A couple of reporters snapped photos from a respectful distance. Ward prowled around the courtyard, taking notes on a clipboard. The mural towered above him, defiant and alive, as if challenging his bureaucratic gaze. Finally, he lowered his notepad, clearing his throat. The city has ordinances against messages inciting violence or hate, he began. There are also rules about profanity and explicit imagery on public-facing surfaces. James resisted the urge to scoff. There's no profanity, no hateful language. It's an artistic expression, people united under a figure who represents hope. Ward's eyes flicked to a segment of the mural where ghostly faces and shadows melded into graffiti-style text. Words like revolt and resist appear in the background. Teresa stepped forward. Those are common rallying cries for social justice, not calls to violence. We see these words in peaceful demonstrations all the time. Ward frowned. It can be interpreted differently. You can interpret anything differently, Teresa shot back, voice firm. But the city's own guidelines emphasize creative freedom, especially in designated art projects. A subtle tension hung in the air. Ward exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, then sighed. We'll submit a report to our superiors. They'll decide if further action is warranted. James caught the uneasy flicker in Ward's eyes, suggesting that pressure from higher-ups, likely with Alden connections, was pushing him to find something wrong. But with the reporters snapping pictures, any blatant move against the mural would look like censorship of community art. Alan Ward offered a curt nod. We'll be in touch. He marched off, colleagues in tow. Teresa turned to James, letting out a tired breath. This was clearly orchestrated. You realize that, right? James glanced toward the street where Ward's car disappeared. I know, but hopefully shining a light on it will stop them from tearing it down without cause. Reporters approached, asking for quotes. Teresa handled most questions, emphasizing the importance of authentic representation in urban redevelopment. James offered a few statements about the Alden Project's commitment to supporting community voices. He maintained a professional tone, but inside, he was roiling with anger at his father's likely interference. Later, when the reporters left, James lingered at the mural. He felt a presence behind him. Turning, he found Luna standing there, hood drawn, eyes wide as she took in the aftermath of the inspection. She stepped forward, scanning his face. "They left it," she said, voice trembling with relief. "At least for now." James nodded. "I rallied some support to make sure they'd think twice." She blinked, tears rimming her eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said simply. A moment passed, heavy with the unspoken. Then, unexpectedly, Luna threw her arms around him, pressing her face against his shoulder. He inhaled the scent of spray paint that clung to her clothes, the subtle warmth of her body. Slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, holding tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm not used to anyone fighting for me." He stroked her hair gently, a rush of fierce protectiveness surging through him. "You deserve it." She pulled back, eyes glistening. The swirl of emotions on her face was part gratitude, part vulnerability, and part cautious hope. Maybe I shouldn't run this time," she said softly. "Maybe I should stay and see if we can make a difference." James smiled, his heart pounding. "I'd like that." For the next several weeks, the threat of removal hovered ominously. Bureaucratic red tape seemed poised to tighten, but Teresa and her allies worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the mural's survival. Luna became more involved with other local artists who were now emboldened to contribute their work to James's project. Walls throughout the development site burst into vibrant life, each mural telling a story of the neighborhood, its struggles, its dreams. One late afternoon, Luna took a step beyond her usual boundaries. She and James were standing in the courtyard, observing a newly finished piece by another artist, a panorama of the city skyline overlaid with historical references to past movements for justice. The colors shimmered in the setting sun. Luna touched James's elbow. "Come with me," she said. He followed her through the partially constructed corridors until they reached a wide staircase leading to an upper level still under scaffolding. Up there, wind whistled across exposed beams, and the city stretched out below in a breathtaking panorama. "I've been scouting a spot," Luna explained, pointing to a towering concrete section. "I want to paint one final piece, something that ties all this together. But it'll be huge." James sized up the wall. "You'll need a bigger scaffold." She nodded, an excited glint in her eyes. "I want it to be bold, something that reminds people they can rise above whatever weighs them down. It'll be my gift to this project, and maybe to you too." His throat went tight at the sincerity in her tone. "I can't wait to see it." They stood there, side by side, the wind tousling Luna's hair. James felt compelled to speak the words that had been building in his chest. "Luna," he said softly. "I." His phone buzzed, shattering the moment. With a grimace, he pulled it out and saw his father's name. Anxiety spiked. Sebastian rarely called, and it was almost never good news. "I should take this," he muttered. Luna nodded, stepping aside, though she looked concerned. James walked a few paces away and answered. Sebastian's voice was brisk. "James, there's a sudden board meeting tonight regarding the project. The investors have concerns about the delays and these excessive murals. Be there at 7. James's frustration flared. "Why such short notice?" "Does it matter?" Sebastian snapped. "We're making decisions about funding and the project's direction. Attendance is mandatory." Before James could protest further, Sebastian hung up. He clenched his phone, a sinking feeling in his gut. Another showdown was coming, one that could threaten everything they'd built. He turned back to Luna, who read the tension on his face. "Your dad?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Board meeting tonight. The investors are restless. About the murals? And probably about me." He slipped his phone into his pocket. "I have to go. I wish I didn't." She crossed her arms, her expression somber. "Will you be okay?" He forced a small smile. "I'll manage. Finish your scouting. We'll get you a bigger scaffold, no matter what." Luna pressed a gentle hand to his cheek, a rare display of affection from someone so guarded. "Good luck." He leaned into her touch briefly, then descended the stairs, 1,000 worries crashing through his mind like thunder. As he left the site, he resolved that no matter what happened in that boardroom, he would not betray Luna or the vision they had forged. A few hours later, James entered Alden Tower, the corporate headquarters. Gleaming floors, mirrored walls, and a constant hum of business reminded him why he'd run so far from this life. A receptionist directed him to the executive conference room on the top floor, where the city skyline loomed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, a half-dozen suited figures sat around a long glass table, the board members representing various interests in Alden Enterprises. Sebastian stood at the head, flanked by a couple of high-ranking executives. The atmosphere was cool, efficient, and vaguely hostile. "Thank you for joining us, James," Sebastian intoned, gesturing to an empty chair. "We're here to address the concerns over mounting costs, potential negative publicity, and the future direction of our urban development project." James took a seat, forcing his shoulders back. "I've been managing those aspects." "What's the issue?" An investor named Donnelly cleared his throat. "We're spending more money on artist fees and so-called creative freedom than we anticipated. And certain images are raising questions among our partners about brand alignment. We're uncertain if this approach aligns with Alden Enterprises standards." James kept his voice steady. "We're revitalizing a blighted area and involving the community. That's what we committed to. Authentic expression drives interest and goodwill. The city itself is watching us set an example of corporate responsibility." A second board member, an older woman, pursed her lips. "The question is, at what cost? The council is supportive now, but what if a wave of protests arises, leveraging these murals as symbols of discontent?" James fought to maintain composure. "There's always risk. But stifling art won't reduce that risk. It'll just earn us a reputation for censorship. That's more damaging long-term." Sebastian watched him, face impassive, then addressed the room. "The board wants a guarantee these murals won't devolve into anti-corporate propaganda. James, can you assure us of that?" James resisted a bitter laugh, remembering how the city official had combed the mural for any sign of subversion. "We've been through every image with the artists. None of them promote hatred or violence." Donnelly tapped a pen on the table. "Still, the presence of words like resist. Those are calls for social change," James interrupted. "They don't necessarily imply attacking corporations." A faint smirk curled Sebastian's lips. "Be that as it may, James, the project's timeline is also being delayed by these artistic endeavors. Construction is behind schedule." James leaned forward. "Because we're ensuring these murals are integrated properly and that the local community is not displaced in the process. Rushing development leads to gentrification accusations and lawsuits." Low murmurs circulated among the board members. Sebastian watched them carefully, then looked back at James. "What's your recommendation, then?" James took a measured breath. "We stay the course. We emphasize that Alden Enterprises supports the community and invests in real, impactful art. We continue to collaborate openly with city officials to avoid further allegations. And if the city demands certain pieces be removed," Donnelly pressed. "Then we fight it," James said firmly. "Or we modify them in collaboration with the artists. We don't just rip them off the walls." The older woman on the board shot a glance at Sebastian. "That sounds expensive." James faced her. "Alden Enterprises is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The goodwill alone from this initiative could outweigh the cost of a few extra months of construction." Another murmured conversation took place among the board members. Finally, Sebastian raised a hand. "Very well. We'll continue under your supervision. But James, if you can't keep this contained, if costs or controversies spiral further, we will assume control." "Understood." James locked eyes with his father. "Understood." The meeting adjourned shortly after, the board dispersing with clipped nods. Sebastian lingered, studying his son with a mixture of calculation and something else, perhaps respect, perhaps disappointment. It was hard to tell. Just as James turned to leave, Sebastian's voice cut through the silence. "James." He paused, looking back. Sebastian exhaled. "I recognize you've put genuine effort into this project. But don't let sentiment blind you to reality. If the stakes get too high, we will do what's necessary." James's jaw tightened. "If that includes destroying someone's art, someone who poured her soul into this, then I want no part of it." A flicker of annoyance crossed Sebastian's face. "Be careful how you define loyalty, son." James said nothing, simply walked out with his head held high. In the elevator descending to the lobby, he processed the conversation, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had bought them time to finish more murals, time to win over more public support, time to prove that genuine partnership with the community could benefit everyone. He headed straight for Luna's neighborhood, anxious to share the news. She hadn't answered his calls, but he hoped she'd be home. Pulling up to the dimly lit apartment building, he climbed the worn-out stairs 2 at a time. Soft light glowed beneath the door to her unit, and he knocked gently. After a moment, Luna cracked the door open, her eyes wide with caution. She relaxed a fraction upon seeing him, then opened the door wider. "Hey," she said, voice subdued. James offered a small smile. "Hey, mind if I come in?" She stepped aside. The apartment was cramped, the walls peeling, but it was neat and smelled faintly of lavender. A few small paintings leaned against the walls, less raw than her street art, but still vibrant. He caught sight of a half-full prescription bottle on the kitchen counter, a stark reminder of her mother's condition. Luna nodded toward an old couch. "Sit," he did, sinking into the threadbare cushions. She joined him, pulling her knees up. "Everything okay?" He explained the board meeting's outcome. "We still have the green light, but they're watching. I think my father's behind these complaints to the city, trying to rein us in." She listened, her brow furrowing. If he wanted to destroy it all, couldn't he just pull the funding outright? James nodded. He could. But that would ruin the public image of the project now that we've gone so far. He's trying to sabotage it quietly, without incurring the backlash. So far, we've managed to keep ahead. A complicated mix of relief and worry washed over her face. This feels like a house of cards sometimes. He reached for her hand. If it collapses, it won't be because we didn't fight. For a moment, she let him hold her hand without pulling away. Then she gazed around the tiny apartment, eyes settling on a shut bedroom door. "My mom's asleep," she said quietly. They adjusted her meds. "She's stable, but the bills," her voice cracked. "It's so overwhelming, James. I hate feeling helpless." He squeezed her hand gently, wrestling with how to respond without implying a handout. "What if we helped you sell some of your smaller art pieces? People in the city are already talking about you. If you had prints or canvases." She hesitated. "I've never liked the idea of turning my art into a commodity." "There's a difference between selling out and surviving," he said softly. "Plenty of street artists earn money in galleries or online while staying true to their roots." She took a shaky breath, considering. Maybe that could work. If I can sell a few pieces, pay the rent, the medical bills. It'd be better than running to a payday loan shark. He nodded, feeling cautious relief. "I know some people who can help set it up, a friend who works at a nonprofit gallery. They focus on local talent. If you let me, I can connect you." She studied his face, searching for signs of pity or condescension. Finding none, she whispered, "All right, let's try." The swell of gratitude and affection James felt for her in that moment was almost too much to contain. He brushed a gentle thumb across the back of her hand, marveling at how a single conversation could tip her future from despair to hope. This was what he wanted, to empower her, not control her. They sat in contemplative silence. Then he noticed the faint circles under her eyes, the tremor in her shoulders. "You look exhausted," he said softly. She gave a half-hearted laugh. "I am." He stood. "I'll let you rest. I just wanted you to know we're not defeated." "Not yet." She walked him to the door, lingering there a moment. The warm glow of a lamp cast a fragile halo around her. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Take care," he whispered. She nodded, a small smile forming. "You too." He descended the stairwell, heart churning with a fierce resolve. No matter how Sebastian tried to manipulate the levers of power, James would stand by Luna, the project, and every artist fighting to have their voices heard. The next day, he followed through on his promise. He contacted his friend at the nonprofit gallery and arranged a small showcase for Luna. Within a week, word spread that the reclusive street artist behind the city's most talked-about murals would display some canvases for potential sale. The buzz was electric. James helped discreetly, ensuring the venue was safe from meddling corporate types who might shut it down. On the night of the showcase, Luna arrived with several pieces, each distinct yet linked by her signature style, bold lines, neon dreamscapes, and subtle messages woven into the background. She wore a simple black outfit, paint still flecked on her fingers. James met her there, stepping aside so she could shine on her own. The gallery was modest, with plain white walls, but the turnout surprised them both. Local art enthusiasts, curious passers-by, and even a few well-dressed collectors from the wealthier parts of town had come to see the mysterious artist who was stirring up such controversy in the development project. Luna seemed nervous at first, eyes darting around as if expecting someone to reprimand her. But when the first few visitors approached her with genuine admiration, no strings attached, her posture relaxed. She explained the concepts behind each piece, her voice steady and passionate. James watched from a respectful distance, chest swelling with pride. A middle-aged woman in a tasteful blazer paused before a particularly striking canvas, an abstract swirl of color that suggested a phoenix soaring through shards of glass. "This is incredible," she said to Luna. "I've never seen such raw energy on canvas." Luna offered a shy smile. "It's a reflection of rebirth. How we break through what confines us." The woman nodded, visibly moved. "I'd like to purchase it." A spark of disbelief lit Luna's eyes. She glanced at James across the room, as if to confirm this was really happening. He gave her a reassuring nod. The woman and Luna discussed a price, and though Luna offered a modest figure, the buyer insisted on paying more. By the end of the night, 3 out of her 5 canvases had sold. As the last guests trickled out, the gallery staff congratulated her. She looked dazed, but there was a light in her eyes that James hadn't seen before. Hope and pride mingled with relief. She approached him quietly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. I still feel weird about selling my work, but this will help so much." He gently touched her arm. "You earned every penny, and you haven't compromised a thing." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Maybe this is a new beginning." James smiled. "We can build from here, step by step." They left the gallery together, the hum of city life enveloping them. Luna clutched a folder containing her newly signed agreements and checks, looking both elated and overwhelmed. "Part of me wants to call my mom right now and tell her," she murmured, "but it's late." "You can tell her in the morning," James said, guiding her toward his car. "Let her see the proof that things are getting better." She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, letting out a shaky breath. "You keep pulling me into this life I never thought I'd have." He didn't reply right away. In truth, she was also pulling him into a life he'd never known, one of raw authenticity, courage, and communal warmth. If they both recognized the collision of their worlds as an opportunity rather than a downfall, maybe they could carve out something entirely new. They drove back to her neighborhood under the glow of streetlights. This time, she didn't hesitate when he offered to walk her up to her apartment. She unlocked the door, stepping inside the dim living area. The hush felt different now, less oppressive, filled with a faint promise of relief. "Stay a minute?" she asked, flipping a lamp on. He nodded, shutting the door behind him. She set her folder on a small table and then turned, eyes locking with his. Before he could speak, she moved into his arms. He felt the warmth of her body, her heartbeat echoing against his chest. Their lips found each other, tentative at first, then hungry with the release of so many built-up tensions. When they finally broke apart, breathless, she whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." He cupped her face gently. "Thank you for believing in me, too." They stood there in the soft lamplight, foreheads touching, letting the enormity of the moment settle over them. Outside, the city might still be grappling with corporate power plays and financial strains. But here, in a tiny apartment with peeling paint, something genuine and rare was taking root. Soon, though, a chime from James's phone broke the spell. He glanced at the screen. Another late-night email from the construction team. Some updates on scheduling. He also noticed a missed call from a number he recognized as one of his father's executives. Luna stepped back, searching his expression. "Trouble," he sighed. "They're relentless. But we'll handle it." She touched his cheek, concern etched in her eyes. "What if your father finds a way to shut everything down after all this progress?" James squared his shoulders. "Then I'll find another way to keep it going. The city is on our side now, at least partially. We've lit a spark I don't think my father can easily snuff out." They exchanged a determined look. In that quiet resolve, James knew they were forging a path that defied expectations, his father's, the city's, maybe even their own. The collision of their worlds had yielded something neither had anticipated, a partnership as beautiful and defiant as the murals themselves. He pressed a final kiss to her temple. "I should go, but I'll call you tomorrow." She nodded, walking him to the door. At the threshold, she lingered, her hand slipping into his. "I'm glad you showed up that day, stuck in traffic," she said softly, a wry smile curving her lips. "Never thought I'd say that about a billionaire heir in a fancy car." He laughed quietly. "Never thought I'd say I was grateful for a city protest." Her smile warmed, and she gave his hand a squeeze before releasing him. He left the apartment, heart brimming with a sense of purpose he'd rarely felt. Luna had become the catalyst for his own transformation, just as he was offering her a pathway into broader recognition. Their bond was fragile, tested by each new obstacle. But if it could withstand corporate pressure and personal insecurities, Maybe it was stronger than either of them realized. Late that night, James returned to the estate, mind buzzing with the day's events. He stepped onto the balcony outside his room, gazing at the distant city lights. In the hush of the early hours, the skyline looked almost peaceful, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place in its underbelly. He closed his eyes and imagined the towering final mural Luna wanted to paint, high on that upper-level wall. He pictured it as a beacon, visible across the cityscape, telling everyone that no matter their origin, wealthy heir or struggling artist, they could rise beyond the constraints placed upon them. And maybe, just maybe, they could do it together. To see more of this story unfold, follow my YouTube channel for deeper dives into art, ambition, and the power of unexpected love.